Picture a construction site in ancient Egypt. The year is approximately 2500 BCE. The workers building the Great Pyramid of Giza are not slaves. This has been established by archaeological evidence for several decades now, despite what popular imagination prefers. They are skilled laborers, organized into work gangs with names, housed in purpose-built workers' villages, fed meat and fish and bread, and given a daily ration of something that their records describe with the same matter-of-fact administrative tone that a modern payroll department uses for health insurance. That daily ration was beer, about 4 to 5 liters of it per person per day. Let that measurement settle for a moment. 4 to 5 liters per day per worker, distributed as a standard component of wages alongside food, not as a bonus or a special occasion treat, but as a baseline expectation of employment, recorded in administrative papyri with the same bureaucratic neutrality as grain allocations. The people building one of the most technically sophisticated structures in the ancient world were, by modern standards, receiving what amounts to somewhere between 8 and 10 pints of beer as part of their daily compensation package. And Egypt was not unusual in this regard. Across ancient Mesopotamia, ancient China, ancient Mesoamerica, ancient South America, ancient Sub-Saharan Africa, ancient India, and ancient Europe, fermented beverages occupied a position in daily life so central and so taken for granted that most ancient administrative and medical texts treat them the way modern nutrition labels treat water, as a baseline assumption rather than a notable feature of diet. So the question embedded in the title of this video, were ancient humans really drunk every day, is one of those questions that sounds sensational right up until you examine the evidence, at which point it transforms into something considerably more interesting and more nuanced than either yes or no can adequately capture. The real answer is, ancient humans were consuming fermented beverages daily in most of the world's agricultural civilizations. The reasons were partly practical and partly cultural and partly medical. The alcohol content of what they were drinking was generally lower than modern assumptions suggest, but not negligible. And the entire relationship between ancient humans and alcohol was so different from modern frameworks around drinking that applying current concepts of sobriety and intoxication to ancient daily life produces more confusion than clarity. Here is the actual story. Begin with why fermented beverages became so central to ancient daily life in the first place, because the answer is not primarily about wanting to get drunk. The answer starts with water. Safe drinking water is something that people living in modern developed countries take so completely for granted that the phrase itself sounds almost redundant. Of course, water is safe, water is water. But for most of human history in most of the world's agricultural settlements and cities, water was not reliably safe. Untreated surface water in any settlement with significant human population and animal presence is contaminated with the full range of microorganisms that cause typhoid, cholera, dysentery, and various other waterborne diseases that were among the leading causes of death throughout history. Ancient people did not understand germ theory, could not test water for bacterial contamination, and had no means of reliably sterilizing water beyond boiling, which was energy-intensive and impractical at the scale that daily hydration for large populations required. Fermented beverages, including beer and wine, are not contaminated with dangerous pathogens in the same way that untreated water is. The fermentation process itself, the metabolic activity of yeasts converting sugars to alcohol and carbon dioxide, creates an environment hostile to the bacteria responsible for waterborne disease. The acidic pH of fermented beverages, the alcohol content even at relatively low concentrations, and the competitive exclusion of dangerous organisms by the fermenting microorganism community together produce a beverage that is substantially safer to drink than the water from which it was partly made. Ancient people did not know why fermented beverages were safer than untreated water. What they knew, accumulated empirically across generations of observation, was that people who drank beer and wine got sick less often from the acute gastrointestinal illnesses that killed so many others. This empirical knowledge, beer is safer than water, wine is safer than river water, fermented beverages are associated with better health outcomes than untreated water, was encoded in cultural practices, in religious traditions, in medical recommendations, and in the administrative policies of ancient states that distributed fermented beverages as part of worker compensation. The Romans understood this well enough to have a specific term for the watered wine that legionaries drank daily, pasca, and to include it in the standard legionary supply chain alongside grain and olive oil. A Roman soldier on campaign received a daily wine ration, not primarily as a luxury or a social benefit, but as a safer hydration option than the local water sources his legion might be camping near. The wine was typically diluted with water at ratios of anywhere from 1 part wine to 2 parts water to 1 part wine to 8 parts water, making the resulting drink relatively low in alcohol while retaining the antimicrobial properties that made fermented beverages safer than unfermented water alone. This antimicrobial logic of fermented beverage consumption in the ancient world is the foundation on which everything else about ancient alcohol use rests. Before understanding any of the cultural, religious, or social dimensions of ancient drinking, it is essential to understand that for most ancient people in most agricultural settlements, consuming fermented beverages daily was in significant measure a public health decision. Not framed in those terms, but functionally equivalent to what we would describe as a public health decision today. Now establish what ancient fermented beverages actually were in terms of alcohol content, because the modern imagination, primed by contemporary beer and wine whose alcohol content is standardized and measured, tends to either dramatically overestimate or dramatically underestimate ancient beverage strength. Ancient Egyptian beer, the daily ration of the pyramid workers, was produced through a process that scholars have reconstructed from textual descriptions, artistic depictions, and residue analysis of ancient brewing vessels. The basic process involved partially baking grain, soaking it in water, adding previously fermented material as a yeast source, and allowing fermentation to proceed for a period. The resulting beverage was thick, more a liquid bread than a modern beer, cloudy with suspended grain particles, sweet from residual unfermented sugars, and typically consumed through straws or filtered through reed mats to remove the thickest solid material. The alcohol content of ancient Egyptian beer, based on reconstruction and analysis, was probably in the range of 3 to 4% by volume in typical preparations, though this varied considerably depending on grain quality, fermentation time, water ratio, and production technique. 3 to 4% alcohol by volume is lower than most modern commercial beers, which typically range from 4 to 7%. A person consuming 4 liters of 3% beer over the course of a 12-hour workday would be consuming alcohol at a rate that, spread across waking hours, would maintain a blood alcohol level well below the threshold of obvious intoxication in most adults. A mild, sustained physiological effect rather than the acute intoxication associated with modern recreational drinking. Ancient Mesopotamian beer, the Sume of Sumerian texts, celebrated in the hymn to Ninkasi, which is simultaneously a prayer to the goddess of beer and a detailed brewing recipe, shows similar characteristics based on textual and residue analysis. The hymn to Ninkasi describes a process involving baked bread called bapire, used as a grain source, honey and wine added for flavor and fermentation kick, and malt for enzymatic conversion of starch to fermentable sugars. The resulting beer was again thick, filtered through baskets, and consumed communally. Alcohol content in the range of 3 to 5% appears consistent with what the described process would produce. Greek and Roman wine represents a somewhat different situation. Mediterranean wine made from Vitis vinifera grapes, fermented fully, could achieve alcohol contents of 8 to 14%, closer to modern wine's range. However, drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric behavior in Greek and Roman culture, associated with northern barbarians and social deviants rather than civilized people. The standard Greek drinking practice involved diluting wine with water at ratios typically ranging from 1 to 2 to 1 to 4, wine to water, producing a beverage with effective alcohol content of 2 to 6% depending on the ratio and the initial wine strength. The symposium, the formal Greek drinking party that produced some of the most important philosophical dialogues in Western history, was centered on the consumption of diluted wine at a pace and concentration carefully managed to produce what the Greeks considered the ideal state of sociable, articulate relaxation without the loss. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Of cognitive control they associated with excessive drinking. Chicha, the fermented maize beverage of Andean civilizations, including the Inca Empire, occupied a position in Andean culture roughly analogous to beer in Mesopotamia and Egypt, functioning simultaneously as a daily dietary staple, a ritual substance used in religious ceremonies, a medicine, and a currency of social obligation. The Inca state maintained enormous chicha production facilities at administrative centers, with the brewing performed by specialized female workers called aklas, and distributed chicha to workers on state projects as part of the amital labor tax system, a parallel to the Egyptian pyramid worker beer ration, operating independently on the other side of the world, in a civilization with no historical connection to Egypt, driven by the same practical logic of maintaining a compensated labor force with a safe and nutritionally supplementary beverage. The production scale of ancient chicha brewing at sites like Huánuco Pampa has been analyzed archaeologically through the identification of brewing vessels, fermentation pits, and storage facilities. And the quantities involved suggest production at the level required to supply thousands of workers with daily rations. Chicha alcohol content, produced through a process that traditionally involved human chewing of maize to introduce salivary amylase for starch conversion before fermentation, was typically in the range of 1 to 3%, lower than most beer, though stronger preparations for ceremonial use could reach higher concentrations. African sorghum beer, produced across sub-Saharan Africa in various regional traditions that share basic fermentation principles, represented a similar dietary staple role in many African agricultural societies. The thick, lightly fermented opaque beer produced from sorghum or millet was, and remains, a significant source of B vitamins, riboflavin, and other nutrients in diets that might otherwise be nutritionally narrow. The nutritional contribution of fermented grain beverages to ancient diets was not trivial. Beyond the safety benefit relative to untreated water, traditional fermented grain beverages provided measurable micronutrient contributions that partially offset the nutritional narrowness of grain-dominated agricultural diets. This nutritional dimension of ancient fermented beverage consumption is often overlooked, but is genuinely significant for understanding why these beverages were so central to daily life. Fermentation produces B vitamins, particularly riboflavin, niacin, and folate, through microbial synthesis. It enhances the bioavailability of minerals by breaking down phytic acid that would otherwise bind them, and in thick, unfiltered preparations provides protein from both the grain substrate and the yeast cells in suspension. An ancient agricultural worker consuming 4 liters of traditional beer daily was not simply consuming empty alcohol calories, they were consuming a beverage that made real contributions to the nutritional adequacy of an otherwise potentially deficient grain-dominated diet. Ancient medical traditions across multiple civilizations recognized fermented beverages as therapeutic agents and incorporated them extensively
general tonic
into
for
medical
convalescent
practice.
patients.
Egyptian medical papyri
The medical
include
use of
beer and
fermented
wine
beverages
as
in
ingredients
ancient
or
medicine
vehicles
was
for
not simply
medicinal
irrational
preparations
superstition.
with a frequency that makes
The
them the most
antiseptic
common
properties of
liquid
wine and
components of
beer,
ancient
the
Egyptian
same
medicine.
properties that made them safer
Sumerian
drinking
medical
options than
texts
contaminated
describe
water
wine as a
made
vehicle
them
for
genuinely
herbal
useful
medicines.
for wound
The
irrigation in
Hippocratic
environments
corpus
without
recommends
any
wine
other
for a range
antiseptic
of
option.
conditions, including
Soaking
wound
wounds in
treatment,
wine, a
digestive
common practice
disorders,
recommended in
fever
ancient medical
management,
texts,
and
would have reduced bacterial contamination of wounds in ways that produced better healing outcomes than washing with local water sources. And the empirical observation that wine-washed wounds healed better would have reinforced the medical status of wine in healing practice. The religious and ritual centrality of fermented beverages in ancient cultures adds another layer to the story that is impossible to disentangle from the practical dimensions. Beer was sacred to Ninkasi in Mesopotamia and to Osiris in Egypt. Wine was the central ritual substance of Greek Dionysian religion, of Roman Bacchic cult,
and ultimately of early Christianity, where it became and remains a sacramental substance. Chicha was fundamental to Andean religious ceremony, offered to the sun god Inti and consumed in rituals marking agricultural cycles, state occasions, and ancestral veneration. The religious status of fermented beverages across these independent cultural traditions is not coincidental. The transformation of grain or fruit into an intoxicating liquid through a process that ancient people could observe but not explain was experienced as mysterious and powerful. The work of divine agency in a world where fermentation was a visible miracle without a scientific explanation. The organism responsible for fermentation was invisible to ancient observers. What they saw was grain soaked in water becoming, after a period of apparent stillness, a bubbling, transforming liquid that produced altered states of consciousness in those who consumed it. This was genuinely mysterious by any pre-scientific standard, and its interpretation as divine activity was not irrational given the observational evidence available. The altered consciousness produced by alcohol was itself understood in ancient cultures as a form of access to divine or spiritual states rather than as impairment in the modern legal medical sense. The Greek concept of enthusiasmos, divine inspiration, literally being filled with the god, was associated with altered states that wine could facilitate. The ritual consumption of fermented beverages at religious festivals was not conceptualized as recreational intoxication, but as a form of communion with divine forces, a temporary dissolution of the boundaries between human and divine experience that the altered state of alcohol consumption could mediate. This religious experiential dimension of ancient alcohol culture operated alongside and intertwined with the practical dietary and public health dimensions in ways that made the two essentially inseparable in ancient cultural frameworks. Beer was sacred and nutritious and safer than water simultaneously, and these three characteristics reinforced each other in creating a cultural centrality that no single dimension alone would have produced. The social function of communal drinking in ancient societies performed the kind of bonding and conflict management work that human social systems require for community cohesion. Shared consumption of fermented beverages at communal occasions, the Mesopotamian tavern, the Greek symposium, the Roman convivium, the communal chicha drinking of Andean reciprocity obligations created and maintained the social bonds that held communities together and managed the interpersonal tensions that dense settlement necessarily produces. The Mesopotamian tavern, operated typically by women called alewives, was a social institution whose functions went well beyond providing alcohol. It was a location where information was exchanged, contracts were witnessed, disputes were mediated, and the ongoing social transactions of community life were conducted in a context that the mild social lubricant of beer made more manageable. The Code of Hammurabi includes provisions regulating tavern operation, specifically targeting alewives who overcharged customers or allowed criminals to congregate in their establishments. Evidence that taverns were significant enough social institutions to require formal legal regulation. The Greek symposium, despite its intellectual associations with philosophical dialogue, was fundamentally a structured drinking occasion whose protocols around dilution, quantity, and order of drinking were social technologies for managing the tension between the social benefits of communal drinking and the risks of unmanaged intoxication. The symposiarch, the designated master of the drinking occasion, controlled the dilution ratio and the pace of consumption, maintaining the group in the zone of sociable relaxation that the Greeks considered the appropriate purpose of wine drinking, rather than allowing the occasion to deteriorate into the loss of control they associated with barbarian drinking practices. The contrast between the Greek-managed symposium and the barbarian drinking style associated with Northern European peoples, consuming undiluted fermented beverages rapidly to acute intoxication, reflects a genuine cultural difference in how different ancient societies related to alcohol rather than a simple difference in how much they drank. Many Northern European cultures did drink to more acute intoxication at ceremonial occasions, and the ritual significance of this more intense intoxication in those cultural contexts was real and important, connected to warrior culture, to ancestral veneration, to the display of social capacity to consume without losing honor. Now return to the original question with all of this context. Were ancient humans really drunk every day? The honest answer is that daily consumption of fermented beverages was normal in most of the world's agricultural civilizations for most of recorded history, but the relationship between that consumption and the state of intoxication is more complex than the question implies. The alcohol content of most daily consumed fermented beverages was lower than modern assumptions suggest. The consumption was spread across working hours rather than concentrated as recreational drinking, and the physiological state produced was generally mild enough to be compatible with the skilled physical and cognitive work that most ancient people were performing daily. The pyramid workers were not building one of the most precisely engineered structures in human history while stumbling around in an alcoholic haze. They were consuming a beverage with the alcohol content of modern light beer spread across a 12-hour workday that kept them hydrated, provided nutritional supplements to a grain-dominated diet, and was culturally understood as simultaneously a daily necessity, a divine gift, and a component of fair compensation for difficult work. That is a relationship with alcohol that has almost nothing in common with modern recreational drinking and almost everything in common with the way modern people relate to coffee. A mildly psychoactive beverage whose daily consumption is so normalized that not drinking it marks you as the unusual one, whose absence would feel like deprivation rather than sobriety, and whose physiological effects are understood as compatible with productive daily function rather than as an obstacle to it. The ancient world was not drunk, but it was rarely entirely sober by modern definitions, and the reasons for that have everything to do with practical rationality, cultural meaning-making, social function, and the specific challenges of maintaining safe hydration in a world without municipal water treatment. The next time someone hands you a glass of water and you take it for granted, remember that you are doing something ancient people mostly could not do. They had to settle for beer instead. They managed,